I don't know whether you all noticed how each of our speakers, I believe, leaped up on the stage, full of energy, ignoring the steps. It's a good sign. It's a good sign. Welcome now to this section of our program called, as you will see from your agenda, Navigating Global Financial Rules, Risks, and Realities. So we have our four speakers who will give their remarks one after the other, followed by questions from the audience. And we'd appreciate it in view of how the mics are set up. If you are contemplating having a question to ask, and we would like to have questions rather than speeches, of course, you might position yourself at a mic in advance just to save time. We'll have our four speakers in the order of, well, I'll introduce them actually. It's a good time to do it all together. The first speaker will be Terry Checky, who is the head of international affairs of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. That is a very heavy title in view of the fact that the Fed of New York is the basic arm of the Federal Reserve System in dealing with international affairs. It does all of the operations internationally for the Fed, and indeed as agent of the Treasury in many cases. He's had a long and distinguished career. I'm not going to go into any details on the bios because you have them all in your publication. Adair Turner is chairman of the Financial Services Authority. You know him very well. It seemed to me there was one part of his CV that deserves some focus, and that is the same year in which he became chairman of the Financial Services Authority, he also took on, I'm assuming Lord Taylor in the House of Lords, took on the chairmanship of the Committee on Climate Change. I see a certain similarity in the years he served as chairman of Financial Services and the climate change that took place during that period. Our next speaker will be Colm Kelleher, who is described misleadingly. He has too many titles to deal with. He's actually the chairman of Morgan Stanley International. He's based in London, and his jurisdiction covers that hemisphere over there. He also had the unenviable job of being chief financial officer of Morgan Stanley for many years. And to me, the very interesting thing is he wasn't trained as a banker, but he was trained as a Byzantinist from Oxford. And I'm sure he sometimes thinks he'd like to go back to that profession, considering how things are today. Our last speaker is Mr. Nakao, who is Vice Minister of Finance for International Affairs. And you'll see from his resume, he has been with the ministry for about 35 years. Prior to that, he spent several years as an economist at the International Monetary Fund. And with that, gentlemen, I will call upon Terry Checky as our first speaker. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dick, for giving me the opportunity to be here today with such a distinguished group. I have to start with two disclaimers. First, for the record, that my comments are personal and shouldn't be taken as reflecting either the views of the Federal Reserve System or the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. And second, that as many of you know, I am not responsible for financial supervision at the New York Fed, which gives me a little bit of distance from the regulatory reform debate. That distance could also cause me to miss some nuances, but I know that I'll be under close supervision up here from my fellow panelists, and I'm sure they won't hesitate to highlight any errors of either omission or commission. In the brief time I have today, I'd like to highlight four mainly qualitative issues. First, the balance of prudential interest versus market efficiency. Second, the scope of regulation and supervision. Third, market discipline. And fourth, the culture of the industry. In the run-up to the crisis, concerns about financial market efficiency and in some cases commercial interests were allowed to override prudential objectives. Recent regulatory reform efforts and greater emphasis on safety and stability reflect an understandable attempt to rebalance that situation. The scope and scale of the regulatory response has, as we all know, been quite ambitious. Authorities around the world have set in motion a range of initiatives to help address the substantial deficiencies revealed by the crisis and to enhance the resilience of the financial system through higher capital and liquidity buffers in particular. Getting agreement across the numerous jurisdictions and issues involved in a relatively short period of time has been a significant challenge. Given the number of stakeholders in various jurisdictions who are simultaneously pursuing reform initiatives, it shouldn't be surprising that, best intentions notwithstanding, these efforts have not always been as well coordinated in terms of priorities, timing, and objectives as might be desirable. And while a great deal has been accomplished, it's fairly clear that a great deal remains to be done. Pushback and attempts by the industry to water down implementation were predictable and have been received with what I think of as an understandable degree of skepticism. At the same time, given the large number of moving parts involved, there are very real questions about how we make sure the parts fit together and the various parties work together. So, as we go about the business of shoring up regulations, closing gaps, and containing excesses and opportunities for regulatory arbitrage, I think it is important that we be mindful of the cumulative impact that the changes underway could have on intermediation, on the nature and location of risk-taking, both institutionally and geographically, and the potential for well-meaning changes to produce unintended outcomes. Minimizing those risks will require continuous efforts on the part of regulators to monitor market functioning and systemic concerns, maintain robust channels of communication and coordination, and to sort through differences as necessary. In this context, I wonder if an environmental impact study of sorts might be a useful addition to the mix to ensure that national and international initiatives are appropriately aligned and consistent with producing the desired outcomes. And I think of this as perhaps a task that the FSB is well positioned to undertake. Second, with regard to the scope of regulation and supervision, I think it's important to be realistic about what regulation and supervision can achieve. They cannot and should not prevent risk-taking or losses, but they have to promote the resilience of financial institutions and the system, primarily through stronger buffers, sturdier architecture, and better processes to deal with distress or failure. In pursuing those goals, however, it's important to recognize that supervision faces a daunting imbalance in numbers. The financial system is simply too diverse, too expansive, and too complex, and the supervisory resources are too constrained to get caught up in an arms race of rules and regulations attempting to match complexity with complexity. I have to confess that I have some sympathy for the view that less might ultimately prove to be more in this regard. That is to say that more simple, straightforward, easily monitored rules such as aggregate leverage ratios and perhaps straightforward guidance on duration matching might ultimately produce more efficient, predictable outcomes than a web of rules involving complex and perhaps easily gamed calculations and restrictions. Building a stronger system requires both regulatory reform and supervisory reform. Capital is a good example. We're raising standards for the quality and level of regulatory capital needs to be complemented by supervisory efforts to promote innovations in stress testing and capital planning, as seen in the Supervisory Capital Assessment Program and the Comprehensive Capital Assessment Review conducted in the U.S. Supervision needs to continue to evolve in the wake of the crisis, and there's a tremendous opportunity for supervisors worldwide to learn from one another and to coordinate efforts to propagate best practice. Third, with regard to market discipline, I wonder if we have the balance right in the degree of emphasis being placed on official oversight rather than market transparency and discipline. To be sure, market discipline was not very effective in reining in risks before the crisis. But since the crisis, supervision has been most effective where it has been linked with greater transparency and aligned with market incentives, such as the recent stress test exercises in the U.S. The say-on-pay rule is another example of attempting to bolster market discipline rather than a highly prescriptive regulatory approach. We should be looking at other ways to promote transparency that work with the grain of the market. Finally, I wonder if we haven't underplayed the importance of culture. Many of the problems that surfaced during the crisis and more recently are indicative of a culture that emphasizes short-term gain at the expense of institutional sustainability. A culture in which regulation is viewed as an obstacle to be arbitraged and circumvented rather than as a check on objectives that firms and employees should follow. That culture is a byproduct of a number of developments, including the evolution of accounting and compensation practices such as allowing booking profits and paying bonuses long before positive cash flows are realized, changes in corporate organization, including the demise of the discipline inherent in the partnership model, the headlong expansion of the size and scope of many firms' activities, and, in my view, most importantly, a trading perspective that increasingly seems to dominate industry management. That needs to change. That change will require a realignment of incentives and leadership from the top. Management, directors, and shareholders must lead the way because if they do not, the likelihood of success isn't very high. Let me conclude by noting that notwithstanding all of the reform efforts, confidence in the financial system as judged by opinion surveys is at a record low, with U.S. banks ranking just above Congress in public esteem, as Minister Schäuble just noted. Such findings may produce a collective shrug in the industry, but I think we should all be concerned about the longer-term effects of weak confidence in an industry whose lifeblood is confidence. As an old friend of mine wisely reminds me occasionally, the root cause of crises is not loss of credit, but loss of confidence. Thank you.
Good there. Thank you.
Well, where have we got to in developing a reformed regulatory framework? What have we already achieved? What left? And what risks and realities do we now need to be aware of? That's what I'd like to cover. I think in answering the first question, it's useful to be clear on where we started. And I think where we started back in 2008 was with a banking system whose capital and liquidity was not just a bit too low, but woefully deficient. I think if you actually try and work out what is an optimal level of capital and liquidity for a banking system, we were at small fractions of it, and that reflected many decades of errors which had got us there. And because the banking system was itself over-leveraged, it was also able to support excessive leverage in the real economy. And I think that issue, which has been mentioned already by Stefan Ingves, that the absolute core of what has gone wrong with our economy and the problems we now face is excessive leverage both within the financial system and vis-a-vis the real economy is absolutely fundamental. So absolutely fundamental to what we've done is the regulatory reform program of Basel III on capital and liquidity. And on capital, I think it's important to realize that we have changed a lot. We've changed things to do with the definition of the denominator, the numerator, and the ratio. And if you add all those three together, we've probably increased the effective required level of true loss-absorbing equity capital by something like 3 or 4 or 5 times if you add all that up. And that was essential to make up for a totally deficient system. Indeed, I could argue, there are some theoreticians, David Miles in the UK, Martin Hellwig in Europe, who argue that on a greenfield basis, if you were designing a capital system for a completely new economy and didn't have to deal with the problems of transitions, you might go higher still. But I still don't think we should underestimate what we have done. We've taken a major step forward. And I think it's also very important that within Basel III, the countercyclical capital buffer is not just another buffer. It is important as a new concept, the whole idea of leaning against the wind, taking away the punch bowl, having a macroprudential countercyclical tool is a major new innovation, again, something which was lacking in the pre-crisis regime, and I think is a major step forward. So I think we have achieved a lot, and with Stefan, I agree that we just need to be clear. Basel III is happening, particularly on the capital. That is it, and it's important to people not to think that we are going to draw back from the implementation of Basel III. But there are still remaining some very important elements of the regulatory reform agenda, and I'd like to highlight 4. First, really achieving resolvability of all banks, however large. I think we've made a lot of progress, for instance, by agreeing key attributes of resolution regimes, but I don't think we're fundamentally going to achieve this end of smooth resolvability, by which we mean being able to resolve banks without inducing systemic shocks and without taxpayer support. We're not going to be able to do that, I think, unless we have a clear level of bail-inable debt, which is unsecured, longer in maturity than a certain term, defined in quantity, and, as the Liikanen Commission has just argued, largely held outside the banking system by unleveraged investors. And although we are heading in that direction, I don't think we're yet, and we need to keep pushing forward. Second, trading book capital. I've said the previous capital regime was clearly deficient. It was deficient even in respect to plain old on-balance sheet loans, but it was even more deficient in respect to trading activities. And though we have plugged some of the more obvious gaps through Basel 2.5, we have more to do addressing the severe deficiencies of value at risk models, which have a systematic pro-cyclical bias and which routinely underestimate fat tail risks. And I think the current Basel Committee fundamental review of trading book capital is a vital initiative. Third, shadow banking. This is an extremely important and very complex subject. If you cast your mind back to 2007 to 8, you'll remember that a lot of the events of the first year of the crisis didn't seem to be about core balance sheets of banks themselves. It seemed to be a whole load of things in this penumbra of activities and secured funding markets and hedge funds and off-balance sheet vehicles, which we label shadow banking. I think it's absolutely essential that we make sure that we have plugged that gap, that we know how to guard against those risks in future. And a key financial stability board initiative for this year, on which I've been spending a lot of my own time, has therefore been to develop a comprehensive package of measures to address shadow banking risks, and we will be presenting that for endorsement by the G20 in November. Fourthly and finally, in terms of the remaining bits of the agenda, risk weights, where I think regulators and the market increasingly recognize a major problem. We moved from the crude category-specific category risk weights of Basel I, a mortgage was 50%, corporate loans were 100%, to the complex risk-sensitive weights of Basel II models. And obviously that had some advantages. As long as all mortgages were ranked the same, that was an open invitation for banks to go out and select the riskiest mortgages. But modeling has created new risks. Our regulatory model approval processes are, frankly, a very imperfect form of quality control. We know that the same asset might be rated significantly differently by different banks, even in one jurisdiction, let alone across countries. And unless we are very careful, model-based risk-sensitive weights will tend to have a pro-cyclical bias. My own conclusion is that when we moved from Basel I to Basel II, we made a mistake. and that we should have maintained for each asset category